Welcome to Insight Meditation, Community of Charlotte. Can everybody hear me in the room? Can everybody hear me on Zoom? Great. Take a minute and look around, see who's in the room. Share a smile or a wave. We used to get up and hug each other, but those were the good old days, right? Hi, Zoomers. So my name is Thia Powers, and I'm your Dharma leader for the evening. I have to tell you, I practiced my Dharma talk before I came in tonight, and I practiced with my cat. And he was actually attentive. So that was, I thought, a good sign. So lately, I have been really aware of change in my life. And so I'm making that the theme of my practice right now, and off and on and off the cushion. And tonight, as the month changes from August to September, I thought we could look at the seasons of a practice, navigating changes in life, because they seem to be pervasive. At least for me, they do. So we'll look at navigating change, and we'll look at how change affects our practice. And then we can talk about the functions of mindfulness in regard to those two things. So anicca or anicca means change or impermanence. And everything, without exception, changes, ebbs and flows. And we know this from our experience in our practice, because a big part of our practice is watching things and seeing them change. Mostly our breath, moving in and out, fast and slow, shallow and deep. But we can also, as we do body scans, notice the physical characteristics of our bodies and how they change, and our thoughts, how fleeting they are, our circumstances, emotions, relationships, everything. One of my favorite quotations that I couldn't locate the author for is that nothing is so constant as change. So we can navigate these changes with the help of our practice of going inside and gaining insight, because the more we do this, the more we begin to trust that we're able to respond creatively to all of the changing situations in life. That's part of the gift of insight. So when I experience a lot of change the way I have lately, I like to refer to it as recalibrating, because that's what I feel like I do when I change to meet the change. Because if I resist, that's a problem. So adjusting the way that we move through life, paying attention to what we do and say and think, is one way that we create flow in our life and less friction. This sounds rudimentary, but without first being willing to change and then having a sense of others around us, what they're going through, what their changes might be, it's easy to say or do things that hurt feelings or cause unintended harm, simply because things are changing all the time. We need to pay attention. And so particularly in Sangha and this group, that's what we pay attention to, are changes with ourselves and others. So does this mean that the friction is completely gone? Nope. We have so many differing circumstances and personalities and viewpoints that there'll be plenty of friction, even if we're all very adept at paying attention and change. But when we do pay attention, it's so easy not to take things personally, to just realize wow, that person was really short with me today. And you don't know that their cat just died, or, something has happened in their life that you're just not aware of. So the main takeaway is that change is just a basic characteristic of life, that things are always changing, and we don't necessarily have to be so reactive. We can be a lot less anxious and easygoing when we roll with the changes. So navigating changes is remembering that change is always going to be a part of our life. And if we could just factor in and accept that piece of information on a deep level, it can relieve a lot of anxiety and distress. So this past month, as everything was mostly ebbing and sometimes flowing in my own meditation practice, I watched it kind of slide from robust at the beginning of August to bone dry in the second week of August. My mind states felt thwarted and sort of dull. And then I began to have body aches and a low humming fever. And I knew I was being visited by the plague. I got COVID. So just as you would have likely done, I just switched over to metta, for my main practice became loving kindness. This is almost always a good choice. And this time, from the stance of that heart space for myself, I was able to recognize that my regular practice isn't always a good fit for the changing circumstances of my life. And especially with this new reality, all I could really do was rest and do metta for me and all the other people that I know are struggling either with illness or anything, and then rest some more. I think I've never slept so much in my life. But what really landed for me was that expecting my practice to stay full and satisfying and robust all the time it's not realistic, COVID or no COVID. So I thought, what are we doing with and to our minds when we assume that our practice is always going to be great, always going to be consistent? Are we in some way just going against a basic characteristic of our very existence when we do that? We're sort of denying the fact of anicca. So I've noticed that just like in my life, my practice has patterns. Maybe you've noticed this too, that your practice kind of has an ebb and flow to it. To some extent, your practice mirrors what's going on in your life. And then there's a certain point in the meditative journey when our practice and our life overlap so much that it's hard to determine where one ends and the other begins. They're both ebbing and flowing, and hopefully they're somewhat synchronized. So we're sometimes referred to as warriors on the contemplative path. And this is because we're instructed to sit with obstacles, to observe them as they run their course and to learn from them. I came very close to missing a great opportunity to have the time to feel into and sit tenderly with some perfectly good COVID suffering. I fell asleep one night thinking of the fact that 6.45 million people have died from this since 2019. And that inspired a lot of metta for me and made me really, really glad that I was healthy enough to move through it without being in grave danger. While I was bedridden, I wondered if the Buddha had times like this. I thought about all the austerities he practiced, giving away all possessions, fasting, going into deep seclusion, so much suffering, all in search of a release from suffering. I imagined him in a cave in India, wearing a rag, bone thin and weak, He had to have wondered and had some doubt about his practice after 3 years of this meditation and fasting. And at some point, he likely would have died from that intense practice. It was too extreme. In his visions and insights, he may have seen that humankind, all these years later, would also face many kinds of troubling times, since he named suffering as one of the 3 characteristics of existence, along with change and not self. Tathagata was the name that the Buddha gave himself. I really love that name. It means one who has gone beyond. And he gave us the foundations of mindfulness, a very detailed teaching that's tailored to get us through rough patches like this. It helps us see the value in recognizing anxiety and pain, and instead of trying to change it, to simply be a student of it, acknowledge it. He must have known that if we were able to practice this way with ourselves, we would then have firsthand experience in practicing, in having loving kindness for others. We've all gone through stuff. This helps us open our hearts to each other when we think in that way. So these foundations of mindfulness are the subject of a well-known sutta, and it gives lots and lots of ways to practice mindfulness. It's been said by the Tathagata, the Buddha, that practicing and understanding this particular sutta can bring a person all the way to awakening, and that we too can go beyond suffering. The proper title of this sutta is the 4 Foundations of Mindfulness, or the Satipatana Sutta. And when we look closely at it, it opens up like a kaleidoscope of mindfulness. The basic structure is mindfulness of body, of feelings, of mind, states of mind, and of dhammas. And that last one is a real interesting thing because it means mindfulness of the true nature or the essence of all things. So from that short list, you can get a sense of just how full that one sutta is. So here's a story about how changes affect our practice. When John and I were both laid low with COVID, our roof had a leak and needed repairs from the summer storms, but the guy couldn't come because we were sequestered. And the yard was not being taken care of, and the grass was super high because it was raining every day. And well, we are the yard crew. The house was pretty messy inside, and our beloved 22-year-old cat Gigi was slowly dying, and she was wailing every night. It wasn't a great time, except for the treats that friends were dropping off. And well, I felt kind of sad. And I turned to the Foundations of Mindfulness, to the Analio book that he wrote, The Foundations of Mindfulness, the Satipatana. He's written three books on this now, on this one sutta. So these teachings gave me ideas on how and when to practice, some ways to work in different ways. And most importantly, I was able to engage my mind with some wholesome thoughts instead of dwelling on everything that was broken or wrong or dying or needing to be fixed all around me. And the upside of this time was I got to do a lot of body scanning almost every day and observe my breath at night when I was challenged in breathing. I watched how often and quickly my feeling tones change and how they're usually directly related to circumstances. And they give rise to my mind states and to my actions. And all of this inquiry came from the Foundations of Mindfulness. So we can see how really connected our emotions, our physical well-being, our mind habits, and our actions are. They're just all bound up together all the time, not just when we stop to observe them. So the dive into the Satipatana Sutta for me changed the 2 weeks of downtime into a personal laboratory of mindfulness in my house. Our meditations in mindfulness and concentration can show us that there's a universe inside of us of bodily processes and feeling tones, a lot of mental quirks, I'll speak for myself, driven by a series of cause and effects, all hitched together, walking around with a name, an address, and a social security number. This is expressed in this quote by John Muir. He says, when we try and pick at anything by itself, we find that it's hitched to everything in the entire universe. To take this mindfulness a little further, we're advised in the Buddha Dharma that when we look at things, to only see them without a reaction. And when we hear things, to only listen without a reaction. And we're advised to try and do this with all the senses. And this is called guarding the sense gates. I feel this teaching has more than a touch of Stoicism, and the Stoics are one of my favorite schools. Seneca, the Stoic, would say, harsh conditions can be softened, restricted viewpoints can be widened, and heavy ones can weigh less upon those who know how to bear them. There's a story about a senior monk who went to the Buddha and asked for the Dhamma teachings in brief. It's reported that the Buddha gave him this response. He said, when for you there is only the seen, the heard, the sensed, and only the cognized, then there is no you in connection with that. When there is no you there, you are neither here nor there. This and just this is the end of your stress and suffering, and this is how you should train yourself. So the Buddha in that moment chose to sum up all of the Dhamma in that guarding of the mind, the six senses, the sense gates. Another role of mindfulness then is to bring us the ability to pause without reacting, to stay aware and cool instead of heated up and reactionary. In short, we're guarding the sense gates, which includes the mind. Does anyone strive in their practice like they try too hard and they want things to happen? Then they swing the opposite way, they get discouraged, they let their practice wane. Anybody do that? Nobody does that. Yeah, some people do. We have a few honest people in here, right? I'm looking for that middle way, avoiding extremes. So I was thinking about this in the car when I was driving a few days ago, and all of a sudden the navigation system clearly said, stay in the middle lane. So now my GPS is coaching me in the Buddha Dharma. Another great reminder of the function of mindfulness is that often it brings us to metta. That feeling of altruistic love, of kindness, of best friend energies. It's open-heartedness. Metta says, ease up, friends. Right now, it's like this. When we want our life and practice to be steady and full and good all the time, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. We're avoiding a basic truth of existence that all things change. And so what progress, you might ask, have I made in regard to this change? And I would answer that I've begun to be a better friend to myself. And so it's how we relate to change that saves us. Flowers bloom, wilt, and die, and so the seeds for next spring's blooms. The weather is perfection for days, and then fierce storms rip through and tear up the roof, and the ceiling leaks. And then the sun comes out again. People fall in love and maybe make commitments, and relationships change and may end or take a different form. The body too is constantly growing, changing, diminishing, and moving towards its expiration date. There's a tried and true remedy to all this change and its inherent potential for suffering. Live according to nature. Don't push the river. Stay in alignment with the way things are. This is perhaps the biggest gift of mindfulness and concentration practices. With our meditations, we naturally remember that there is a season for everything, and that it doesn't help much to cling to wanting things to be different. It's better to try and work with what is. And this is especially true with our practice. In our practice, we have a real-time reflection of our own life, viewed from the perspective of awareness. And when we pay attention, it can be a pretty interesting show in there. So one more thing. Venerable Ayasudama told us last week that difficulty can bring us to the cutting edge of our practice. And this was the thing that really stuck with me from her talk last week. Difficulty can bring us to the cutting edge of our practice. Maybe you've never heard a teacher advise this, but sometimes, for me at least, the cutting edge might mean taking a break from my more formal practice, at least for a short while, because when I practice out of sheer determination and duty, and I lack curiosity or even willingness, my practices become predictably empty and dry. So occasionally, maybe take a break. I realize I'm going out on a limb here, but allow considering yourself to change your practice up, do a different kind of practice, switch your regular time, or sometimes shorten the practice to 5 or 10 minutes if you're trying to push for a longer practice on a consistent basis. Sometimes it's too much. So I personally have found these approaches to be beneficial for me. I feel like I have an executive privilege in my practice. I don't recommend severing your investment in the relationship with your practice, because it can be hard to get it going again if you completely quit. But I do recommend exploring friendly alternatives. Eventually, like me, you may miss your longer sits, and then you get to willingly choose them. You're back in the driver's seat. Also, for those times when I'm particularly unmotivated to sit, I resort to breathing and weeding practice. Being in the garden for me, breathing and weeding in a dew-soaked morning air is like pulling obstinate weeds in my mind. So don't give up on practice. Just recognize that change happens. Change can be challenging, but as they say, if you can breathe, you can meditate. The Buddha lived his own life of challenges. For a portion of his life, he struggled with having to be a prince in line for a rulership when he knew in his bones that that was not his path. He chose to leave a wife and a newborn son and a legacy of wealth and fame, and chose extreme practices with Indian sages and holy men in hopes of finding abiding peace and freedom. And he eventually abandoned that too, and discovered the middle way that your navigation will probably tell you about too. Avoiding extremes was a lesson he gladly offered us today from his lived experiences. So all of life is a curriculum for awakening. Mindfulness simply means noticing what we're thinking or seeing or smelling, those sense gates, and then noticing how we're responding, or if we even need to respond. The more willing we are to simply witness and be present with everything, and this includes the terrible things that are happening in our lives, and also to remember daily your own death will come one day. We don't know when. You might be surprised at the way that this helps you see more clearly how precious the time at hand is to be committed to wholesome thinking and kind to yourself and others, and to not eagerly grasp too much at anything. In our Sangha, we have a rare opportunity for a contemplative life, We're not monks, we're householders. But once we've tasted the sweetness of a mind that learns to sit in peace, our hearts and minds just naturally seek this. It's our essence. Yearning for the ability to hold as much as we possibly can, with wise view, clear intention, and extra compassion, is an epic choice in life. So hopefully tonight's talk might help us navigate change skillfully, because it's coming. See how change affects your practice and maybe titrate your practice. And notice the function of mindfulness in the midst of all these ongoing changes. We hear in the Buddha Dharma that desire is a cause for suffering, but this kind of desire for a strong and virtuous practice is not a cause for suffering. It's part of the path to its ending. Mindfulness in the midst of change provides us with the GPS, a turn-by-turn sort of guidance to freedom from chronic suffering and delusion. It sounds grand, but really, it's just us here together, navigating moments. That's all.